Paul Nobuo Tatsuguchi was born in Japan and came to the United States as a young man. He studied medicine in California, took an American nickname, and became to spend his life as a medical missionary. He married, he married, he had two small daughters. In the front of the Bible he had written 4 words, "Therefore, choose life," Shitit. Then, in 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army drafted him. He did not want to be a soldier. He was made one anyway and shipped to the coldest, loneliest posting in the empire, a rock in the Bering Fog, garrisoned by roughly 2,400 men under a determined colonel named Yasuyo Yamasaki. Tatsuguchi ran a field hospital dug into a mountain pass. He treated frostbite and pneumonia and the slow illnesses of men living underground in a place where the sun rarely showed, and in a small notebook, night after night, he wrote down what he saw. That notebook is the reason we know what the last days on Attu were like from the inside. On the American ship steaming north in May 1943 was a 22-year-old private from Colorado. His name was Joe P. Martinez. He had been born in Taos, New Mexico, the youngest of a large family that moved to a sugar beet town called Alt when he was a boy. He had been drafted the previous August, trained at Camp Roberts, and assigned to Company K of the 32nd Infantry. He was, by every account, an ordinary soldier, quiet, well-liked, unremarkable. He carried a Browning automatic rifle. In 2 weeks, on a snow-covered ridge nobody at home had ever heard of, he would do something no one who knew him expected. On the 11th of May, the Americans came ashore in fog so thick that landing craft lost sight of the beach and of each other. Scouts paddled in through the darkness first. The main force followed at Massacre Bay in the south and Holtz Bay in the north. There was almost no one on the beaches to meet them, and for a few hours it seemed the intelligence had been right, and this was quick. Then the Americans started to climb inland, up out of the fog, and the mountains above them opened fire. Yamasaki had not put his men on the beach at all. He had put them on the high ground, and he had been waiting 11 months. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. The fighting settled into a grinding, upward crawl through some of the worst ground American infantry faced anywhere in the war. There were no trees, no cover, and no roads. The valleys were spongy muskeg that swallowed boots and vehicles. Above them, the passes were choked with snow and defended by machine guns dug into rock, sighted to sweep every approach. Fog rolled in without warning, so thick that soldiers lost their own squads. And it was cold, a wet, penetrating cold that got inside a man's clothes and stayed there, night after night, in uniforms never meant for it. What that cold did is the fact that ought to define Attu, and almost nobody knows it. Of the Americans who fought there, 549 were killed by the enemy. More than 1,100 were wounded. But over 1,200 more were taken off that island by frostbite, trenchfoot and exposure, and hundreds more by disease, thousands of casualties inflicted by the weather itself. On Attu, the island fought too. Men lay in freezing water in shallow holes for days, unable to move by daylight because the mountains above them were watching. Some supply planes could not find them through the fog at all, and they went hungry. On the other side of those ridges, conditions were worse. The Japanese garrison had been cut off from resupply. Their ships could not get through. In the field hospital, the doctor recorded it in a few flat lines that say more than any casualty table. He wrote of the shelling and the constant naval gunfire. He wrote of the men he could not save. And one evening, near the end, he noted that he had eaten half-dried thistle picked from the hillside. The first fresh thing he had tasted in months, and he called it a delicacy. The two armies were starving and freezing on the same island, a few hundred yards apart. It broke at the passes. To reach the Japanese base at Chichagof Harbor, the Americans had to force their way through narrow defiles between the mountains, Jarman Pass, and the high saddle below a jagged spine the soldiers called Fish Hook Ridge. Attack after attack went up into those passes and came back down again. The enemy held the crest. The snow gave no cover. Every advance had to be made uphill, in the open, into machine guns that had been ranged on that ground for months. By the 26th of May, the attack on the Holtz-Chichagof Pass had stalled again, and men were dying for a few yards of snow. What one man did on that ridge is the heart of this story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We're just getting to it. Because on the 26th of May, the reinforced battalion pushed up toward the pass one more time, and one more time the attack faltered under machine gun, rifle, and mortar fire from above. Men went flat in the snow. The way advances do when everyone understands, without saying it, that to stand up is to die. And then, in the middle of that stopped attack, Private Joe Martinez stood up. His Medal of Honor citation describes it in the Army's plain, unhurried language. In the face of severe hostile machine gun, rifle, and mortar fire, it says, Private Martinez rose to his feet and resumed his advance. He climbed, firing his automatic rifle as he went. He stopped now and then to turn around and urge his comrades on, and they came. Behind him, a stalled battalion started moving up the snow again. He worked forward through the trenches near the crest, clearing them with his rifle and grenades, and he did not stop climbing until the enemy's hold on the pass was broken. He gained roughly 150 feet of that mountain, and he took his battalion with him. At the top of the pass, as the position finally fell, Private Joe P. Martinez was shot and mortally wounded. He died the next day. He was 22 years old. For his actions, he received the Medal of Honor, the only one awarded for the Battle of Attu, and the first earned by an American soldier fighting in the Western Hemisphere in the Second World War. The pass he opened was the door to the last Japanese ground on the island. Everything that followed came through it. By the evening of the 28th of May, it was effectively over. The Americans held the high ground above Chichagof Valley. Colonel Yamasaki's command had been pressed back into a narrow pocket against the sea, out of food, out of ammunition, out of any hope of rescue. American guns were being brought up to bombard the valley at first light. Yamasaki had perhaps a few hundred men still able to fight. There was no way off the island, and in a field hospital in that valley, by lamplight, an army doctor opened his notebook and wrote for the last time. What he wrote is why we are telling this story. He knew what was coming. The last assault is to be carried out, he wrote, and then plainly, only 33 years of living, and I am to die here. He wrote about his family. He said goodbye to his wife by name. Goodbye, my beloved wife, who loved me to the last. He wrote to the daughters he would never see grow up, one of them an infant he had never met. There is no defiance in it and no hatred. It is a doctor at the end of the world in the cold, writing down that he loved his family. Then he closed the notebook. Before dawn on the 29th of May, Yamasaki did the only thing left to him. He gathered every man who could still stand and threw them straight at the American lines in one final charge, driving deep into the rear areas before it was stopped. By the time the fighting ended, Yamasaki was dead, and the garrison had ceased to exist. They had chosen death over surrender, almost to a man. Of roughly 2,400 Japanese soldiers on Attu, 28 were taken alive. The wounded in the field hospital did not survive that last day. We will leave it there because the details do not honor anyone. Dr. Paul Tatsuguchi died on the 29th of May, 1943, killed by American soldiers in the last confused hours of a battle he had never wanted to fight. He was 33. Among the men who came up onto that ground afterward was an American named Dick Laird, and in the pockets of the dead doctor, the Americans found the notebook and something else. A Bible, its cover worn, with 4 words written inside the front. Therefore, choose life. The diary went up the chain of command where intelligence officers translated it, looking for something useful. There was nothing useful in it, there was only a man. And then something unusual happened. The translation started to circulate. Soldiers copied it and passed it around. It reached men who had never been near Attu, in camps and on ships and back home in the United States, in the middle of a war whose propaganda worked hard to convince them that the enemy was not quite human. And here, in the enemy's own handwriting, was a doctor saying goodbye to his wife. What it did was complicated, and it did not stop the war. Some who read it were unmoved. Some were angry that the man had been a doctor and had still, at the end, been part of the fight. But many were shaken, including men who had been at Attu and had done what soldiers do, and now found themselves reading the private words of the person they had killed. One of them was Dick Laird, the soldier who had come up onto that ground. Laird carried Attu and that diary for the rest of his long life. Decades later, he went looking for the doctor's family to give something back. He found a daughter. Laura Tatsuguchi Davis had been a small child in Japan when her father died on an island she could not have found on a map. She grew up, moved to the United States, and built a life here, in the country where her father had once studied medicine. Another American veteran of Attu wrote to her too, and returned the thing he had carried away from Jarmin Pass in 1943. Her father's Bible. She opened the cover and read, In his handwriting, the 4 words he had chosen before he went to war. That Bible is kept now at the Japanese-American National Museum in Los Angeles. 3-part close, Part 1. Tree beat Private Joe P. Martinez of Old, Colorado, was 22 years old when he died opening the pass on Fishhook Ridge. His Medal of Honor was the only one awarded for Attu. His body came home, and a mountain pass on that island, a Colorado highway, and an armory bear his name. 549 Americans died on Attu, and thousands more were carried off it by the cold. Dr. Paul Nobuo Tatsuguchi was 33 and left a wife and 2 daughters. His diary is still read. And on a treeless island at the western end of America, where almost no one goes, the ground where all of them fought is a National Historic Landmark. Quiet now, under the fog. A battle on American soil that America forgot. A private from a beet farming town who stood up when standing up meant dying. And a doctor who wrote "Choose Life" in the front of his Bible, and then had no choice at all. The soldiers who read his diary did not stop fighting, but some of them stopped being able to pretend that the man on the other side of the ridge was not a man. People still argue about why Attu vanished from the national memory, the fog, the distance, the fact that the enemy left almost no one alive to tell it. Maybe you have a view. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Aleutians, in Alaska, or anywhere in the Pacific, in any branch or any unit, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The men who fought on Attu deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.